So I do want to thank y'all for signing up and for attending the third part of our Leap Texas webinar series. We were very disappointed at not being able to hold the 7th annual conference this year. However, we were very glad to be able to facilitate the exchange of ideas and presenting of some of the sessions that would have been at this year's event online. So there are a number of great presentations that we have done this week and we have scheduled over the next couple of weeks, and I think there will be even a few more this summer. So keep an eye out for those. We'll be putting out registration information about those as they come available. The registration links for those that we already have scheduled are out there. You can check out the Leap Texas site for those links if you need to. Today's topic is more than a thesis or a dissertation, promoting effective assessment of graduate programs. My name is Dr. Jeff Roberts. I am the Director of Assessment at Sam Houston State University. I'm also the Vice Chair of Leap Texas. And when we're able to have a conference, I've been the Chair of the Conference Planning Committee. So you may have seen me around or gotten an email from me once or twice. We are hopeful that we'll have a face-to-face conference next year. And we'll just see how things go. But thank y'all for participating in today's webinar. If you do have questions or comments, please do make use of the chat function. I'll be able to monitor that and addressing questions that you may have. There will be some time at the end for questions as well. So I do want to start off with a little bit of just about what our institutional profile. Who's Sam Houston State University, what Sam Houston State University is. We're a four-year public university, approximately 22,000 undergraduates and graduate students enrolled, with approximately 90 bachelor's programs, 57 master's programs, 10 doctoral programs, around 15 certificate programs. To give you an idea of the size and scope of our institution, and we are classified as a doctoral research university and a community engaged university by the Carnegie Commission. Also want to give a shameless plug that we were a 2019 Excellence in Assessment designee. Very proud of that, and very proud of my staff, a couple of whom I believe are tuned into the webinar today. So kudos to Brandy and Tama for their hard work on that as well. If you're not aware of what the Excellence in Assessment designation is, it's co-sponsored by BSA, NILOA, and AAC&U, recognizing institutions that are engaged in effective assessment practices and using assessment data rather than being the focus of the award is on processes and use of assessment data. We were one of 7 institutions recognized in 2019, 27 in total since the award was first announced in 2016. First Texas institution, quite proud of that fact. I highly encourage, if you've looked at the award and thought about applying for your institution, to consider doing so. It's a great educational experience just doing the application alone, and it's well worth your institutional time, and that vast amount of time that we all have right now, right? So if you're interested in learning more about Sam Houston and the Office of Academic Planning and Assessment and what we're doing, I've included a link to our website there. I do encourage you to go and take a look. We have a wealth and host of resources available on our website that are free to share. So I do want to start with kind of a question, and to put us in the framework of today's discussion, what are some of the common struggles with graduate program assessment? This is an area that I see a lot of programs on my campus struggle with, graduate programs. And I would bet dollars to donuts that if I quiz other assessment directors and graduate directors, that this is something that they may see struggles with as well. It's not that they don't have good people there. It's not that they don't have good students. And it's not that they don't have good assessments of student learning. But they sometimes struggle in getting it well documented and conceptualizing some of that. So when I have talked to programs and thought this over, these are some of the common challenges that I see and hear. It is, particularly for master's programs, limited program lengths. A master's program is 30 to 36 hours. You know, it is 2 years of full, you know, kind of going full-time class time. If you're dealing with a graduate certificate, it could be 12, 15, 18 hours. Doctoral programs, they're going to be longer. You have more meat there to assess, but, you know, masters in programs, this is something that they struggle with in terms of, you know, data collection and points of assessment and capturing their students. Another area of difficulty that I see with some of our programs is small program enrollments. So if you have a small master's program, small doctoral program, small cohorts, you know, that, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8 students, unlike an undergraduate program where you have potentially dozens, if not hundreds of majors, with a small number of students enrolled in a program, it can be harder to pull and capture that student learning data. You know, it's hard to do analysis with small n's, so that is a legitimate challenge. Some graduate programs have limited faculty resources and times; they're stretched thin. It may be, you know, for a smaller master's program, or even in some cases larger master's program, you have a core faculty of only 3 or 4 faculty under the guise of a program director. Maybe even less, maybe only 1 or 2 full-time faculty, and then a bunch of kind of floating adjuncts or folks that fill in. So that full-time faculty core is limited, and they may struggle to carve out the time, you know, in addition to their teaching and research and master's capstone work and doctoral thesis dissertations and defenses. So those are some logistical challenges that I oftentimes see programs facing. And then I also see some other things as well. Sometimes there's a lack of clear understanding of the programmatic learning objectives. I mean, they know at their heart what it is that they want their students to be able to do, but they may have difficulty articulating that. And they've not necessarily been asked to articulate that in this kind of way before. And sometimes with some of these programs, there's a lack of structure to the program curriculum. Many years ago, I was in a master's program, and it was kind of a smorgasbord in terms of the classes I wanted to take. You know, I was able to kind of pick and choose my own adventure in terms of what I wanted my educational program to be, and I got a very good education. I learned a lot. But when you're thinking about how to evaluate the student learning, a program curriculum that lacks structure can make it difficult to make sure that those learning objectives are being incorporated and scaffolded in an appropriate way to easily assess them and to make sure that the students are getting them. So those are things to think about when you're thinking of some of the challenges to effective graduate program assessment. And I would encourage you, if any of you are feeling brave and want to pop into the chat, what are some of the assessment challenges you or your programs face that I may not have listed on that? And we'll read them out for the good of everybody and for the recording. We find that it is sometimes hard to distinguish between master's and PhD level work, particularly in a course level assessment, and then the thesis and dissertation are more about length and format rather than clearly articulated levels. That is a very good comment, Jane. Yeah, particularly for programs that are blended in terms of you have both master's and doctoral level students that are taking the same courses. So what are the outcomes for the master's? What are the outcomes for the PhD? What are the levels of expectation for that? Those are some good comments there. And we'll address some of the issues with thesis and dissertation a little bit later in the presentation. Raquel, I believe that's how you say it. My desktop. Fortunately that is not needed for this presentation. Raquel, for some, this is our first time doing assessments and unsure where to start. That is not an uncommon thing that I hear from faculty of all levels, not just master's and doctoral, but undergraduate as well. It can be a little scary. Hopefully, there will be some helpful tips and tricks in this presentation that will help you have a starting point after this. Melissa, we have similar troubles because our master's classes are cross-listed with our undergraduate courses. That can also be problematic. Particularly, I'm not sure what institution you're from, Melissa. I know that cross-listing courses down, the master's to the undergraduate, you have to make sure that the learning outcomes are appropriate for those levels. It's as opposed to cross-listing an undergraduate course up. That can be done, but can sometimes be more difficult. Yeah, it's that can be, because you have two different levels of performance that you would expect. You wouldn't necessarily expect your undergraduate students to perform at the same level of the master's students, and that would be okay because they're not master's students. The master's students should be doing more. They should be above and beyond that. So good comments. So let's talk a little bit about what I think are some of the keys to effective graduate program assessment. The first thing I want to lead off with is you need to make sure that you're involving all of the program faculty in the assessment. That is such a key portion of assessment practice. And I would also say that these are, while this presentation is on graduate program assessment, a lot of these tips and tricks are applicable to undergraduate assessment as well. So if you're thinking about ways to do that, they are applicable there as well. So keep that in mind. Starting with effective student learning outcomes, for me, that is the most important aspect of quality assessment, is having good student learning outcomes or good programmatic outcomes. If you don't have well-articulated outcomes, it is real hard to develop effective measures to assess those. It is real hard to collect data around those. It is real hard to take effective action based off that data. Making sure that you are aligning your curriculum to your learning outcomes to ensure that you have full coverage of those student learning outcomes throughout your curriculum. We'll talk a little bit about that later. I have done a separate webinar that you can get through the Leap Texas site on curriculum mapping. I think it's a very powerful tool that programs can use of all levels, but graduate programs, it's in particular, can be a very powerful tool for them. You need to think about how you can scaffold your assessments from the assignment to the program levels. And then rotate through. Some folks, I say this and they think it's sacrilege, but it's true. Rotate through your student learning outcomes and your assessments to keep it manageable. If you're really thinking about the learning that's taking place within a program, you could have as many as 10, 15, or 20 student learning outcomes for a graduate program. That is not a crazy number if you really think about it, and if you really kind of get into the details. Now, trying to assess 20 student learning outcomes in any given year is too much. I wouldn't do it. But you can assess 5 a year. You can look at 5 of your assessment measures a year and rotate through those. Now, you can be collecting data on the rest of those or on most of those in the off years, but only do the analysis, rotate through your analysis. That is okay. It's okay to do that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation as well. I want to start with that first key bit, though. One person in your graduate program should not be doing all the assessment work, period. I do sometimes see this, both at the graduate level and the undergraduate level, where they basically have given it to one person, usually an untenured faculty member, assistant professor, and it's almost like, I don't want to say that the others don't necessarily want to be bothered with it, but it's like, yeah, it's something that is not at the top of their priority list. If that is happening, it is not going to lead to a very good assessment process. It takes a village to do assessment. That is just the reality of the situation. Assessment truly is a group activity, and it needs to be. It should be the faculty that are in charge of the program that are driving this process. And this is a great opportunity to involve all of the faculty that are involved in teaching the program, both tenured faculty, tenure track faculty, and even your adjunct and contingent faculty as well. If you have full-time adjuncts that are regularly teaching courses that are part of your curriculum, you should be involving them in the discussions around the curriculum design. You should be involving them in the discussions around the assessment of the curriculum. You know, it is the program faculty that are the ones that should be determining whether or not the course and programmatic student learning outcomes are appropriate. What should be taught within the courses and how the curriculum should be structured. What should be assessed and how. And then they're the ones that need to be analyzing the data and determining what actions should be taken for improvement based off that collected data. Those are important activities that need to be done as a collective whole. One person in a program can't do all of that and make those determinations and effectively make change. That's just the reality of the situation. When I have these conversations with the graduate programs, I sometimes get this question. But what does that impact? What does that do? What does that mean for academic freedom? Is that somehow a violation of academic freedom? Unpopular opinion, but when I hear this, oftentimes this is what I think. Because the reality is these are characteristics of effective program design and assessment. And they are not a violation of academic freedom. They're not a threat to academic freedom. In fact, I think that they're the pinnacle of academic freedom and shared governance. You notice if I go back to those previous slides, there was nothing in there about me, the assessment director, telling the programs what the student learning outcomes should be or how they should be assessed. It's the faculty that are needing to make this determination. So, effective student learning outcomes. Like I say, all effective assessment starts with clearly defined student learning outcomes. This is one of those truisms for me. If you don't have good learning outcomes, the rest of your assessment plan will struggle to be good. In case you are fairly new to this, what is a student learning outcome? Banta and Paloma, 2015, have a definition: the expected student learning or behavior in precise terms, providing guidance for what needs to be assessed. I also like to say the stuff and things you expect your students to be able to know and do because you taught it to them. A little bit tongue-in-cheek there, but I think that's quite true in a very colloquial sort of way. Programmatic student learning outcomes. When we're talking about a graduate program, we're talking about what the outcomes are for that, the student learning outcomes are for that program. And I think that has a kind of specific definition to it as well. And this is the one that I like to use. The necessary knowledge, skills, and abilities gained by students through the course of their educational programs, which they should be able to successfully demonstrate at the point of completion. You know, if I ask a program, what are your programmatic student learning outcomes? What I'm really asking is, what are the things that you want your students to know and be able to do upon graduation? That's the content that you are teaching them. What does that look like? What are those items? What are those skills? What are those knowledge areas? It's going to be different for every program. I don't know those. And this is where, again, it comes from the faculty teaching those programs that have to make those determinations. So what are not good student learning outcomes? And I do see these on occasion. And I'm sure that if there's other assessment directors on the webinar today, you have probably seen these as well. Students will successfully pass their comprehensive exam. That's problematic as a learning outcome. The levels of expected knowledge, what the students are expected to do, the things that they're expected to know, there's a lot that goes into passing a comprehensive exam. I've taken several in my life. There's a lot of knowledge that is inside that. But just simply stating your outcome as they're going to pass doesn't tell us what the knowledge was expected to be demonstrated. Doesn't tell us what the students learned. Similarly, with students will successfully defend a thesis or dissertation. I see those as well, particularly at the PhD level or the doctoral level. Yes, that is a program requirement. You have to pass you have to defend your thesis or dissertation in order to graduate. But again, that doesn't articulate what learning took place. Even more problematically, students will earn a B or better and a made-up course, underwater basket weaving 6394, underwater basket weaving methods. For anyone that does assessment, particularly within the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, you know that using course grades for assessment is the kiss of death. A course grade is a great indicator of whether or not the student passed the course. It is not a good indicator of what specific learning took place inside that course. There's a lot of things that make up a course grade that does not make it an effective assessment tool. There are things like attendance. There are things like professionalism. There are things like engagement. There are things like extra credit assignments. There are opportunities for students to do better on certain assignments that are related to certain learning outcomes and to struggle on other assignments related to other learning outcomes within the course and have it average out to an acceptable grade. There's so much to unpack in a course grade that it just is not a good effective assessment tool, and it is not a good learning outcome. So now that we've talked about the bad, what are some things that make for good programmatic student learning outcomes? Good programmatic student learning outcomes should speak to the mission or the purpose of the program. I should be able to, when I read through your student learning outcomes, have a good sense of what your program was about, what it is that you were expecting your students to do, what it is that your program is. Even as someone that isn't familiar with your program, I should be able to determine that from the learning outcomes that are presented. Good learning outcomes are going to identify the specific areas of knowledge, skill, or ability that you're expecting your students to be able to demonstrate. They should articulate the level of expected student performance or ability. They should be written in a way that is measurable. Very important for a learning outcome. Has to be measurable. And they should be, at the programmatic level, your learning outcomes should be comprehensive of all of the areas of expected student knowledge, skill, and abilities. They should be comprehensive. Important things to note. So important, I emphasize it again here as, again, all of the key knowledge, abilities, and skills that you're expecting the students to get through the program. This is where rotation comes in as a tool for managing this. So let's talk a little bit about curriculum alignment and design as the next tool. So I want you to think to yourselves and reflect upon your own program's curriculum design. If you're teaching within a graduate program, if you're a coordinator of a graduate program, or if you're an assessment person like me, think about some of the programs that you work with and interact with. The first question is, does the program have a design? And safe space here. Sometimes when I ask this question, the answer is not really, not one that is intentional. It is, it was created sometimes years ago, and it's just been kind of chugging along, doing its own thing, and it's been, modified, like, the ship of Thesis, that the planks have fallen off and new planks have been hammered on, and it may not look very much like what was originally developed, when the program was proposed 20 years ago, or more for some programs. So that's a good question to start with. Do you have a design? And if you do, what does that design look like? Does your program have a clear sequence of courses through which the students progress? And if there is, if it is a structured curriculum, is that course sequencing addressing all of your program's student learning outcomes? And then are all of those student learning outcomes being assessed? Or does your curriculum design look more like a buffet menu, where students can pick and choose from a menu of multiple courses? This is fine. This is acceptable. There's a lot of effective, successful graduate programs that have a, kind of choose your own adventure type curriculum, where you have a set of core classes that the students are taking, but then students can branch out into different areas and they can pick and choose tracks perhaps. But if you do have a curriculum that is set up in such a way, again, how are you ensuring that students are getting all the necessary program student learning outcomes, and how are you making sure that each of those SLOs are being assessed? I mentioned earlier about curriculum mapping as being a powerful tool for this. And I'm not going to go into too much detail in this because, like I said, I've done a whole other webinar on this that you can certainly go check out. But curriculum mapping can be useful. You know, and if you're not familiar with curriculum maps, this is just a very rough example of one. You have your learning outcomes along one axis, you have your course sequencing along the other axis, you have identified using the matrix where each of your learning outcomes are being introduced, where they're being practiced, and then where you're expecting students to demonstrate mastery of those learning outcomes at various points throughout the curriculum. And if you've never done a curriculum map of your program's curriculum before, it can reveal things that you didn't know. It can reveal things like SLO 9 on this particular map that is not being covered within the curriculum. One of those examples that everybody else thought that somebody else was teaching it. And so they didn't teach it in their class. And it turns out that no one was teaching it. You can identify learning outcomes like SLO 6 that are being introduced and being reinforced throughout the curriculum, but there is no expectation that the students will demonstrate mastery. Maybe that's appropriate, maybe not. SLO 5, where there's an expectation that the students will just know that at the end of the program, but it wasn't taught to them in terms of introduced or reinforced throughout the curriculum. Maybe it was a pretty basic learning outcome in terms of its content, and it's something that is fine for the students just to be able to demonstrate that they got it at the end. But you know, maybe you do need to introduce that along the way. Maybe you need to think about your curriculum in that way. So curriculum maps can be very useful for identifying gaps and figuring out the points of intersection between the curriculum and the learning outcomes where assessment can take place. So let's talk about what that assessment can look like. And there's 3 levels of assessment that I see that I talk about with my programs when I'm doing assessment coaching and things of that nature. You have assignment level, course level, and program level. And most folks are most familiar with assignment and course level because that's their wheelhouse if they're teaching. Assignment level is the specific student learning outcomes that are evaluated with a specific student assignment that is assessed through that test, that quiz, that paper, that project. Course level assessment. So now we are moving up to the learning outcomes for your course. And those are oftentimes evaluated using a multiple number of assignments or assessments. Program level. So now we've gone up one level. And each level we get is a little bit larger and a little bit more general. The specific student learning outcomes for your whole degree program that are being evaluated with multiple student assignments or assessments and student artifacts from multiple points throughout the degree program curriculum. The good news is that your assessment, Kathleen, could you mute yourself? Yeah, thank you. We're getting feedback there. That student learning outcome assessment can and should be scaffolded. So we talked about the levels of assessment, assignment, course, program level. Those can be scaffolded up and down. So naturally, your individual assignment level assessments are all being incorporated at the course level to determine the student grade in that course. But those individual assignments and course level assessments can be rolled up to the program level as well to address programmatic learning outcomes, particularly if they've been well designed and well developed. Those learning outcomes can and should be aligned from the assignment to the course of the program. If you do that, assessment of a lot of these becomes a whole lot easier. You bake it in from the beginning. So let's talk about some of the characteristics of effective SLO assessment. getting into the meat of why you're here. So your identified assessments should clearly design to your to the desired student learning outcomes. This is one of the things that I see programs struggle with the most. Oftentimes because the student learning outcomes they have created and written are too broad or generic. But it can also be the case that the assessment wasn't well thought out or well designed, or does not align well with the outcome that is being expressed and desired. And if you have a poor alignment there between the outcome and the assessment, or if one or the other is too general, you're going to struggle to provide useful data on student performance and learning. Something to keep in mind when you're building assessments and you're thinking about your assessment processes, there's been a lot of discussion in higher education assessment around reliability and validity. And we should be having those conversations. We should be striving for assessments at the course, at the assignment, course, and program levels that are reliable and valid and fair. But we at the same time also cannot let perfection be the enemy of good. This is where, again, faculty involvement in this process is key. The faculty are the experts. The rubrics and assignments that they design carry content and theoretical validity. That is good. For most of the programs, I couldn't, I would not be qualified to develop an effective assessment for them because I'm not a content expert in those areas. Faculty are. Once you have good assignments and good rubrics designed and put into place, then you can work on applying those consistently over time. That will help ensure reliable assessment. So we have the content and theoretical validity. Now we're working on reliability. And this is where the use of things like well-designed rubrics or common assignments can really help to promote that reliability and consistency in your assessments across the curriculum. Oftentimes I'm asked, so Jeff, that's great. Jeff, we want to do that, but where do we start? We're intimidated by the idea of trying to create all of this from whole cloth ex nihilo. That is fair. So don't. Start with what you already have. Start with your existing assessment measures and processes that you have already embedded within your curriculum. Because if I was to go to any graduate program, I could go and look at the course syllabi and find specific assignments that are aligned with course learning outcomes and programmatic student learning outcomes for the program that could be used for assessment purposes. Go to those most key courses. What are the courses that every student in the program has to take that are hitting the most important learning outcomes? Because I bet you dollars to donuts that there's already great assignments, great student learning data already there. Capture it. Use that data. Start with your existing learning artifacts. Start with the existing assignments, the existing student papers and projects. If you're a program that has licensure exams, use those. And yes, even your comprehensive exams, your thesis, and your dissertation, when done right, in terms of an assessment tool, can be good artifacts. It is only after you have exhausted these things, and you still have learning outcomes that are not being adequately assessed, that I would encourage you to begin developing new assessment tools. Start with what you have and then build out from there. Because if you start with what you have, you're going to have plenty to work with to start. So as the title of this presentation promised, I do want to talk about how comprehensive exams, theses, and dissertation can be problematic as assessment tools for graduate programs. This is something that I have worked very hard across my campus to get my graduate programs away from using these exclusively, with fairly good success. It's not that they aren't good. It's not that they don't serve a purpose. But as an effective assessment, program learning assessment, they can be problematic unless they are approached in certain ways and set up in certain ways to get at that data. The issue with them as assessments at the program level is that these artifacts, whether it be a thesis or dissertation or comprehensive exam, are not always well aligned with your broader programmatic student learning outcomes. That does happen. Not to say that everyone's is, but I have seen it happen. More commonly, they're oftentimes scored in very holistic ways. There isn't a clear rubric for that. It's very much the subjectivity of the individual scores, which calls issues around consistency into question, and in how that score was determined. If you just have a fail, pass, high pass, or just a pass fail, you're not able to really suss out where the areas of strength and weakness were in the student performance. And then I said there the consistency issue in terms of subjective scoring. Another issue that I oftentimes see with comprehensive exams and theses and dissertation is that there is this expectation that all students or nearly all students will successfully complete these projects. Take the dissertation, and Catherine, I see your question there. I will get to that in just a second. Take the dissertations, for example. For doctoral programs, I will see as an outcome, a learning outcome for the program, that all students will pass their dissertation defense. And sure enough, every year, all students pass their dissertation defense. And that's good. That is to be expected. Quite frankly, if a program is letting lots of students get to the dissertation defense and the student is unable to successfully defend, then that program has larger issues. The reality is, the fact is that that programs typically are not letting students get to these sorts of capstone experiences, whether it be a comprehensive exam, a thesis, or a dissertation, unless the student is ready. There will still be some students that aren't, or of their own accord just can't quite cut the mustard. But that's not, that's the very slim minority of students at that point, and it should be. We as a graduate program isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing if it's allowing their students to get to that point. So as an assessment tool, in terms of helping you identify ways that you can improve student learning and identify the strengths and weaknesses in student performance, if 100% of your students are passing it without any sort of further depth and detail to that information, it really isn't a good learning outcome at that point. It's just a program requirement. And that's fine. Those program requirements are good, but it isn't so great as an assessment. That's okay, because there are ways that you can approach these sorts of projects to help make them better assessment tools. This is one thing I always remind my programs when they talk to me about these types of assessment measures and wanting to use these, is that no two students pass their comprehensive exams or defend their dissertation in the same way. So yes, they both may have passed, or they both may have high passed, but there's individual differences in what they were good at, and what they were successful at, and what they still may struggle with to some extent. Not struggle with to the point that they're going to risk not passing, but areas that they could have done better. So if we're going to use these types of artifacts for assessment of programmatic student learning outcomes, you have to show how the artifact, whether it be a thesis or dissertation or comprehensive exam, is aligned with your programmatic student learning outcomes. And if you tell me that it is aligned with all of your programmatic student learning outcomes, I'm going to ask you, really, because there's probably should be like 20 of those. Where? How? Because it probably isn't aligned to every single one of them. And that's okay, because you can only do so much in one project. Assessment of student learning of those other learning objectives, even at the capstone levels, have taken places or should have been taking places elsewhere throughout the curriculum. That's okay. So tell me which ones it is aligned with. and point that out. Tell me how the pieces do. So take a dissertation or thesis, for example. There's lots of things in there that align with potential programmatic student learning outcomes for a graduate program, like research methods, effective written communication, the ability to synthesize primary and secondary literature, the ability to conduct detailed statistical or qualitative analysis, the ability to effectively communicate if you're having to do an in-person defense, those sorts of things. Because now I've just rattled off about 6 programmatic student learning outcomes that would potentially align with one of those artifacts. So that's the first step, is making sure that there's alignment between the learning outcome and the artifact that you're using. But you also have to make sure that the way that you are evaluating those artifacts is done in such a way that you can collect data that will help reveal the strengths and weaknesses in student learning. Because as I've said, no two students pass in the same way. The data need to be the data need to help you understand where student learning can be improved and the way that the program can be strengthened. So yes, the student passed, but they did really well on A, B, and C, and over here on outcomes D, E, and F, they had some areas for improvement. They still did enough to get by in those areas, but it was not their strong suit. Okay, maybe it was just that student. However, if you have multiple students and you're seeing patterns in terms of consistent areas of strength and consistent areas of weakness in the student learning, sorry, my dog just sneezed, then that was going to reveal something that you as a program can potentially take action on. And also, these artifacts, a thesis, a comp, your dissertation, need to be evaluated in such a way that it's consistent and replicable. Yes, you're going to have individual differences on dissertation committees, but as programmatic faculty, everyone should be on board in terms of what the minimal expectations are. And this is where someone was in the comments suggesting the use of creating rubrics and working backwards. Using rubrics, clear, identified rubrics for evaluating some of these is really powerful. This is something that a number of the graduate programs at my institution have started enacting. Consistent rubrics for evaluation of comprehensive exams or theses or even dissertations that align with the student learning outcomes, the programmatic learning outcomes that are being evaluated through those mechanisms, and be able to collect data on those in terms of areas where the students are doing well and areas where the students could still stand to improve some, because that is information that you as a program need to know if you're going to be using these tools as effective assessment measures. Ask yourself this question when you're thinking about your program assessments, whether they be the thesis, the dissertation, comprehensive exams, or one of your program assessments embedded within one of your courses. Does this assessment help us understand and improve student learning? Is it providing useful data? Because if the answer is no, then you have to ask yourself, is it really an effective program assessment? And the answer is probably no. That is an assessment that either needs to be modified to make it effective, to make it provide useful data, or stop doing it. The classic, well, we've always asked the students to do X, Y, and Z. Well, do you look at the data? Well, no, because it doesn't tell us anything. And why are you asking the students to do it? Either modify the assignment, modify the assessment, modify the exercise, or try something different, try something new. One of the trends that I've seen in graduate education, I've seen it within the broader literature, I have seen it at my own institution, and I applaud it personally, is the broader use and adaptation of portfolios to assess student learning in graduate programs. A lot of programs, particularly master's programs, where they traditionally had a thesis versus non-thesis options, and fewer and fewer students are actually doing master's theses these days. But even doctoral programs, potentially. Maybe not in lieu of the dissertation, but as an additional assessment measure. But master's programs, some master's programs have done away with the theses, the thesis altogether, and have gone exclusively to using capstone portfolios, where students are able to build a portfolio of artifacts from across the program curriculum, demonstrating how they have mastered the program learning outcomes. And then that portfolio is the thing that is being evaluated at the end. Student portfolios, excellent tools for program assessment. Again, as any assessment, they have to be aligned with your programmatic learning outcomes. The artifacts are needing to be evaluated either within the courses themselves. So these are graded artifacts that came out of individual courses through like a research methods course, or a writing course, or a content course that are hitting upon those learning outcomes, or they are artifacts, they're assignments that were completed for one purpose within a course, but that you are then evaluating kind of third party at the program level outside of the course by a panel of faculty. So secondary scoring. The great thing about portfolios, like I said, the students can provide artifacts to those from multiple points across your program curriculum. And it really provides you a very useful tool for being able to watch and observe student learning and development over time, and to be able to see where students are improving and where students are not. And then, as I mentioned earlier, please consider putting your assessments on a rotating schedule. Assessment is only effective if it's manageable and meaningful. Those are my mantras: meaningful and manageable. Particularly with a large assessment plan, and it can be, if your assessment plan is well thought out and well developed, it may be large. I did a program review with a graduate program a few years back, and I was pretty easily, just from their own course syllabi, able to identify about 25 programmatic learning outcomes. And the faculty in the program were like, well, we really can't argue that these are the things that we're wanting our students to learn. You can't assess 15, 20, 25 learning outcomes every year. Don't try. Don't, you put them on a cycle, put them on a rotation. That is not bad assessment. That is, in fact, a hallmark of good assessment practices. That is a hallmark of assessment maturity. By rotating through your SLOs and your assessment measures, you will help ensure that all of your SLOs are being assessed over time on a reasonable cycle. It will make your assessment of your large programs much more manageable. And this is a really useful tool for programs with low enrollment numbers. If you're trying to assess your learning outcomes, but you only have 5 students in your cohort, and you're just looking at those students, it's real hard to make judgments off that data. Whereas if you allow the N to build up a little bit, so you are collecting data on that learning outcome for 3 years, but you only evaluate and you analyze that data every 3rd year. Suddenly we no longer have just 5 students. Now we have 15 to 20 students that we're able to look at the data from. And also we may even be able to look at some longitudinal data. So are students staying consistent over time? Was it just, this one group was just an off semester? Or are we seeing consistent strengths and weaknesses in student learning and performance that we can take action on? So those are some things to keep in mind as you are developing and implementing the graduate assessment. And that does bring me to the end of the formal presentation. And I did see some messages pop up in the chat, and I'm going to go back and take a look at those now. And also, this time, if you have other questions, I would encourage you to do so. And for the last few minutes that we have here scheduled, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. So, looking back, Jane commented that for quantitative and qualitative skills instruction, usually has to be pitched at the bachelor's level. Okay, so that's I think in reference to cross-listed courses. Catherine, would you recommend using one piece of evidence for more than one SLO? For example, a dissertation could be used for research skills analysis, etc. Yes. A single artifact can be used for multiple, a single artifact or assessment can be used for multiple student learning outcomes, but you need to be able to identify and tell me the areas of learning or the domains within that. So that's where rubrics can really be useful tools to help identify that, because particularly if it is a domain-based rubric as opposed to a holistic scoring rubric. Domain-based rubrics meaning that there are specific areas of that rubric that are focusing on specific points. So we can then point to, that this assignment or this assessment instrument, this portion of it is speaking to this learning outcome versus this portion of the assessment instrument is speaking to this learning outcome over there. But yes, double dipping is perfectly fine and acceptable. Also, Catherine asked, what is your thought on using the same rubric for grading the assignment in the class versus using that rubric for assessment purposes as well? That is also perfectly acceptable if the rubric is something that everyone can get on board with for program assessment. So if the rubric is well designed, well developed, that the faculty in the program can reasonably look at it and go, we think that is perfectly acceptable. We think that it is covering well, that the scores from that rubric within that class, we're willing just to lift that out and take that and include that in the programmatic learning data. Perfectly acceptable. And vice versa as well. If you have a programmatic rubric that that you've been using for third-party scoring, but you have an individual faculty member going, boy, I really like that. I want to incorporate that in my class. Go for it. Do it. Jane commented, we have found the DQP helpful for looking at our undergraduate and master's expectations. Is there equivalent tuning instrument exercise for the PhD level programs? I don't think that there is quite like that. And I don't think that, the DQP is a really wonderful tool from NILOA. But I don't think that they quite break down, graduate in terms of master's and doctoral. It's been a while since I've looked at the DQP, but I don't think that they get that nuance. Unfortunately, there isn't something quite like that for the PhD level. Although you could probably take a stab at locally, building upon something like the DQP, and then basically just turning the knob up to 11 for those kind of outcomes for what the next level of performance and expectation would be for PhD programs. Now, the other thing too is that with PhD programs, the area of knowledge is getting finer in terms of what we're expecting students to know and be able to do. There's so it's the depth of knowledge in broad isn't the same as it would be for an undergraduate or even a master's education to a point. But the level of skills and abilities around a very small subset of knowledge is expected at a much higher level. Jane, we are looking at some temporary changes in light of the COVID-19 pandemic for our currently graduating students, particularly our clinical research-based programs in which students cannot complete their research because of health concerns. One of my master's students has shifted some of her research to a systematic review instead of primary research. What are the potential pitfalls or issues in shifting expectations, assignments, and assessments for this year? That's an excellent question, and something that we've been talking around on my campus and that I've been talking with others. And I wouldn't even just be thinking about for the rest of this year. There's very real possibility that this is something we're going to have to be thinking about in terms of the online shift for the summer, definitely, and maybe even the fall semester or beyond, either fully or in part. We need to think about ways that we can be flexible with our assessments. And so what I've been telling programs in these times is that this is when it is most important for you to really have a good grasp of what the learning objectives for your program are. What are the most important things that you need your students to do, that you want your students to know and be able to do at the end of the program, or at the end of a course, or at the end of an assignment? And be thinking about different ways that students can actually demonstrate that knowledge. We're going to have to be flexible, because if you can find, yes, we've always done an assignment in a certain way, or we've always done this assessment in this certain way. But just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean that we can't try other ways of doing it, or having students doing multiple ways, as long as they can still demonstrate the key learning that is that we need, and that learning is taking place. So shifting your course expectations, or shifting your assignment expectations to better match the ongoing situation is fully appropriate right now. And if I was advising one of my faculty in terms of how they would talk about that in their end-of-year assessment reports, state it just like that. You know, that we typically would do this assessment, but we can't do this assessment right now. So this is how we've modified it, or we've given students the flexibility in terms of the final product. However, we can show that the final product still demonstrates student attainment of the required learning objectives. And if you can demonstrate that, the specifics of the assignment really matter less. Other questions? We do have a few more minutes. Just a couple though. Elise, we are constantly encouraging our grad faculty to utilize existing assignments. I mean, but the issue we see is how those assignments are being evaluated. There isn't any clearly defined criteria. It's mostly based on the faculty's own expertise, so it seems very vague to non-experts. When we provide them feedback about providing more clearly defined criteria, that's when we get pushed back. Difficult to navigate this with some faculty. Any tips? The more you can get the faculty having that conversation in the room together, sometimes you can iron out some of those differences that particularly around kind of broader programmatic learning outcomes. And sometimes the way you get around this is for certain learning outcomes, or for certain assignments, if you can't get everybody in terms of what they're doing in their course on the same page, that can be a good candidate for a third-party scoring, in terms of, okay, everyone can, score and evaluate, student writing however they wish in their individual course. But what we're going to do is we're going to pull a sample of 3 or 5 student papers from every section, or from a subset of sections, or from a subset of courses, and we're going to score them as a group of faculty using a rubric that we all agree on at a program level. We're going to redact them of student names, we're going to redact them of faculty names, we're going to order some pizza back in the old days, or we're going to do a Zoom meeting these days, or we're going to do them individually, but we're all going to score them using this rubric. And we're going to use that as the program assessment. That can sometimes get around that. And then with some faculty, are still going to push back. And that's just the reality of that. And you work around them as much as you can. Work with those that are willing to work with you, and work around those that aren't. Okay, final question. Jane, do you have any advice about using peer feedback in programmatic assessment? For example, we have students provide feedback using rubrics of dissertation defenses, but we aren't sure how to use the data. I think it is very useful. And I love the fact that you're inviting students to the dissertations. Of course, students are welcome to our dissertations as well, but that they're using rubrics to evaluate the dissertation defenses. I would ask what the data is telling you. Are the graduate students that are doing that? Because I think that there's a double assessment there. Not only could that potentially provide y'all some data around the students that are giving the dissertation defense, if you think there's some value to it, but also what the students that were doing the evaluation, what is it telling you about those students, and their knowledge of research methods, and their knowledge of data analysis, and their knowledge of how to structure a presentation. I think that would be fascinating information in terms of kind of a double-sided assessment there. So, just on the surface, when you look at that student data, the student evaluations, is it saying anything that is useful to y'all? Are y'all seeing data in which that you can take action and all that? But also at the same time, what is it saying about the students that are doing the evaluations and about their knowledge and their learning? Because I'm guessing those are probably students that are approaching the dissertation phase or approaching their own defenses. So are you able to turn that around and then see, areas for helping, lift those students up in some areas that could potentially be weak before they get to the dissertation defense themselves? So, all right, it is 2:02 actually. Thank y'all for attending the presentation. I will be posting the slides and a copy of the video to the Leap Texas website, and the video will be on the Leap Texas YouTube page. So I will be sending a link out of that once it is available to those that registered for the webinar, and will be out there for perpetuity. So hope to see you all at future webinars. Y'all stay safe and healthy. Have a good day.